Concern yourself. So real quick, let me mention the introduction. Hopefully you all get a chance to look at that. That was pages 1 through 10 in your textbook. Just a reminder, that's the practice of, am I holding that up? Yeah. Practice of Creative Writing by Heather Sellers, 3rd edition. And I asked you to look at the introduction. And basically, I'm just going to mention that the nice thing about the intro is it's quick and it gives you a snapshot of the entire textbook. That is the points that are really going to be punctuated within the textbook. That is the really important stuff. So it talks about writing for yourself, writing for others. And as in chapter 1, the intro says, look, it's great to write for yourself. Keep a journal, keep a diary. That's important. That's actually part of a writing habit you should be setting up for yourself. But when you are talking about creative writing, you're writing for others, right? You're writing to be read. So those are two separate things and they complement each other. But just be aware that when you are starting to write your poems, your stories, your creative nonfiction, you're not just writing for yourself anymore. You're writing for the audience. Okay, you're writing to be read. And that's an important distinction. We'll talk more about that. The intro also talks about images, energy, tension, pattern, insight, and revision. And I'm not going to go too far into those right now. I just wanted to kind of plant those in your brain. Those are the chapters that we're going to be reading this semester. It's going to move quickly, as I said, because we are just an 8-week class. So there's going to be some reading that's packed in there, but it's all very interesting. I think it's a great textbook. So those are images, energy, tension, pattern, insight, and revision. We'll dig deeper in those as we go along. And finally, the intro talks about how important it is to read. I could tell from your introductory discussion assignment where you answered those questions that all of you are readers, and that's awesome. Because the final thing I want to say about the introduction is writers read. This is the best advice professors gave me when I was taking my writing classes. The very best thing you can do, besides having a writing habit and writing rituals, is to read other writers. This is how we learn. This is how we get a sense of how other people have been doing it down through the years. Contemporary, modern work, as well as work that came before. If you're not reading other writers, then you are not enveloping yourself in the language. You're not getting a sense of the possible forms, and you're definitely not getting a sense of how the greats have approached this, okay? Sometimes you can look at other writers and sort of mimic what they're doing as you're building your own writing strategies. That can be really helpful. You can kind of imitate other writers until you find your own voice, which is the ongoing process. But I just want to say, creative writers read, they work with other writers, and they share their work. All of those things are true, especially in a workshop class. So that's the introduction. I hope you got a chance to look at that. And the final bit of business from the textbook is chapter 1. I'm just going to kind of quickly move through. Let me pull this up here. Hang with me for just a second, guys. I want to make sure this is recording. Am I recording? Yes, I am. Okay. And no. And yes. Thanks, guys. I told you my computer's kind of slow. Just want to make sure it's running. Yep, there it is. Great. Okay. I'm going to keep moving pretty quickly here because I want to keep this lecture as short as possible. So, chapter 1 in your textbook. Got my little list here. What I wanted to mention were some of the high points that are going to show up on your quiz. And those include, flip into my page, the very beginning, the mind's eye. Heather Sellers talks about how important it is to be able to envision that which is written on the page, right? And she invokes Shakespeare and Hamlet, who sees his dead father in his mind's eye. It's real, she says. Just because you're imagining it doesn't mean it's not real. And when you're writing, what you're trying to do is share what you're seeing and hear with the reader. That's your mind's eye. And I think that's a really great point. She also talks about writing what you see. This is a great place to begin your writing practice. We all have different experiences. If you can share what you're seeing both internally and in the world around you, and if you can do it effectively, that's a really strong step in the writing process. She also mentions in chapter 1, this is something I definitely wanted to make sure I hit in this tiny lecture, that writers should avoid the kind of quick trick techniques that keep us from really looking closely at the real world and focusing on the people in it. That is, you don't need those shortcuts because they don't help you produce really good work. Instead, what produces good writing, I'm quoting Heather Sellers here, is accurately noticing specific, real, living individuals and instances. Focus on the things you notice and focus on the very small things you notice. Those are the things other people, non-writers, pass right over. This is your job as a creative writer. What are you seeing in the world around you? Not just the stuff everybody's looking at. Let me flurf my hair. There, I feel better. But the things that perhaps others aren't knowing. What's askew? What's off in the world? What are you hoping to share that seems as though it should be commented on? And again, shared with your readers. So again, you're avoiding those quick trick techniques, the kind of plot your novel in 30 days, create fabulous characters in an hour. That's BS. It takes time to write. Sometimes the stuff comes quickly, sometimes it doesn't, but there's no shortcuts. You just have to, pardon my French, put your ass in the chair and start writing, okay? And again, it's predicated on what you're seeing in the world around you and in your mind's eye. I think that's really true. Another point that she mentions in chapter 1, I think that's on page 14, is readers can't be expected to work so hard when they're reading your work if you're not providing clear images. They can't get there, okay? So the central lesson of the chapter, write from a focused place. If you see in your mind's eye the fruit, the animal, the breakup scene, your reader will see it too. If it's accurate for you and you're using specific, simple language, naming what you see, keeping part of your mind in focus on the live scene, the image, then that is going to translate for your reader. As Heather says, many writers mistakenly believe that scene painting is good writing, and they include unnecessary adjectives and adverbs to decorate and enrich the writing. You don't need all that foo-fa. In creative writing, you don't want to spend a lot of time painting the perfect fruit. For example, the glowing red orb pocked with holes made denizens of the humble earth. That is ridiculous language, way too fancy, doesn't really create an image in your eye. Instead, you just say old apple. Then we know what you're talking about. And of course you can build on this, but the real lesson here is keep it simple, keep it clear, make sure those images are translating for your reader and that you're not making it difficult for them with all that extraneous language that doesn't really add up to the image. And the image is what you're looking for, the strong image, so that the reader can see it with you. Just a couple other things I wanted to mention. Practice noticing what you like to read, what moves you, what affects you. If you're enjoying it, then you can use some of those techniques in your own writing. Keeping track of and articulating to yourself what makes other writers' pieces memorable and powerful, and then you can use those techniques to improve your own writing. Okay, let's see. I had one or two other points that I know I've included on the quiz that I wanted to mention. Yes, focus. Besides the mind's eye, Heather Sellers also talks about the importance of focus in creative writing. And one of the points that I really enjoy in this chapter is that she says you can write about anything you want as long as you, number one, focus on what you see, and two, write as truthfully and honestly and accurately as possible. I'll say that again. One, focus on what you see, and two, write as truthfully, honestly, and accurately as possible. As you look for good subjects, no matter how fantastical, made up, or imagined, keep in mind those two considerations. Write about what you know and write about what defines us as a human. Okay, what you see truthfully, honestly, and accurately. If you are genuine in your writing, if you're honest and your voice is true, that's going to come through for the reader. So finally, she talks about the image. And for poetry, especially for poetry, but also for fiction and creative nonfiction, that is essays, considering the image is incredibly important. And of course, when we say image, we're talking about what you can picture. What is visual? How do you present that successfully in creative writing? As Heather says, often people say, I have an idea for a poem or a story, but it's better to have an image. If you can start with the picture of the cat, for example, my cat's dozing on the couch behind me. She's black and white. She has icy green eyes. If I wanted to start writing, I would start with the image of her behind me and go from there as I move into plot or metaphor or whatever I want to make manifest in my creative writing. So the primacy of the image, the importance of the image is incredibly, I really can't punctuate enough how important it is to think about what kind of image you are producing for the reader with your creative writing. And as Heather says in this first chapter, I should call her by her last name, that's more respectful. As Sellers says, as you're training in the craft, write only what you can write. That is, what's your personal experience? What do you know? What have you lived? Some people think, oh, I haven't lived an exciting enough life to have anything to write about. But listen, as the famous writer said, anybody who gets through childhood has something to write about. Okay, so what do you know? What can you share? What can you offer to the reader that they haven't experienced themselves? She talks about creating a list of secret worlds. That's going to show up on the quiz. More on that later. And I think there was one final focus I wanted to mention in the chapter: mind's eye, focus, image, and sustaining and establishing a writing habit. As I said earlier, a journal, a diary, all that's great, but the most important thing you can do is set a time every day. I struggle with this myself, but if you can set a time every day where you say to yourself, nothing else is going to happen, I'm going to sit down and I am going to write, dang it, my creative writing. If you're a morning person, do it in the morning. If you're a night owl, do it at night, but dedicate that time to your writing. Flurf. And make sure that nothing else gets in the way. Make that your priority. And if you do that over and over, just as with any habit, once you've done it for 7 days, 14 days, a month, it becomes a part of you, right? That's just true of any practice. Soccer, music, art. You have to do it every day. You have to exercise that muscle, your brain or your actual muscles, and then it becomes muscle memory. Right? So a sustained writing habit, it's the only way, everyday practice, that's how you get better. And as Sellers says, writers are simply people who have figured out how to spend enough time in the writing room every day in order to create enough work so that some of it is good. Because some of it, P.S., is going to be bad. It's going to be terrible. But then some of it's going to be good. So you got to write enough till you get to that good stuff. And last but not least, flow. Sellers talks about getting in the zone. If any of you are athletes, then you know this feeling where sort of everything falls away. The basketball hoop becomes enormous. You can't miss. You're in the zone. It's almost like a hypnotic state. I've had this happen quite often when I really, really spend a lot of time creative writing. It's as though something is channeled through you. A muse is speaking through you. Everything sort of becomes distant except what you're creating on the page. And it's an amazing feeling. And again, you have to have that sustained writing habit to get to that place. So that is flow, the state of creative concentration when you are involved in an activity and you go into a kind of focused trance. You play for hours at pastimes that absorb you: video games, lacrosse, cycling, knitting, talking. You fall out of time and become lost in the narrative. You create and sustain another world because you do it all the time. Same for creative writing. If you're really giving yourself over to it, then when you write creatively, your task is to get yourself into that state. And again, if you're doing it enough, you will. So that's chapter 1. I've really moved quickly through it. It also talks a little bit about procrastination and making it work for you. My face just disappeared. There we go. Avoiding that judgmental voice that tells you, this is terrible, stop writing. Don't listen to that voice, just keep writing. And we'll talk about some tricks to avoid that judgment. And of course, at the end of the chapter, starting on page 27, there is a really terrific reading by Jared Rosello, a Cuban-American writer, called The Neighbor. And there will be a question on the quiz from that particular reading. So make sure you get a chance to look at that. It's a story that's accompanied by images. It's a sort of a graphic novel, short story by Jared Rosello. It's really interesting. I'll be excited to hear what you have to say about it. So I promised for my last piece of the lecture to talk about a final ekphrastic poem example. Looks like I'm in about 18 minutes. I'm going to try to keep this to 20 or right around 20, so it's not too long. So bear with me. I'm going to show you a poem and the image that inspired it. I'm sure many of you have heard of Vincent van Gogh, the famous artist who was quite troubled, right? And one of his most famous pieces was Starry Night. I'm going to pull it up here on the screen. There it is. I'm going to move my head down here. So that's Vincent van Gogh's The Starry Night from 1889. What a gorgeous piece, right? He wrote that when he was, I believe, he had put himself into an asylum for the mentally ill. And so he was writing this, painting this. Sometimes I think about creative writing all the time, and that's what comes out. He was painting this at a time that was very, very difficult for him. And I believe there was a relapse after he created this. I love this painting, The Starry Night. And what's interesting about it, we talked about writing what you know. The critics say this is not what he was seeing out his window. It was a combination of what he saw in his mind's eye and perhaps another landscape from another time. But it's quite beautiful, but also quite dark. You have the light and the dark sort of at war, and then this tree that sort of comes out of the front of the frame and sort of takes over with that gorgeous backdrop. But you have this image right at the beginning that's sort of looking over the entire town at the bottom of the hill. And then, of course, that gorgeous starry night, right? So this is such a famous image. And a poet named Anne Sexton, who was herself quite troubled and, in fact, took her own life tragically. She was a very, very troubled woman. And there were things in her life that were extremely upsetting. We won't go into all of that, but she is considered one of the great confessional poets, and her poem, The Starry Night, is ekphrastic. She wrote it as a piece that was inspired by Vincent van Gogh, by The Starry Night, by his painting, but also perhaps by the man himself, who was incredibly troubled, as was Anne Sexton. So I'm going to move my head back over here. I'm just going to read this out loud, point a couple things out, and then we will conclude. I really want this to be flurf. I really want this to be an example you can use as you're writing your own ekphrastic poems, and pay attention to some of the techniques she's using here. This is about the length I'm hoping your poems are going to be. If you want to go longer, that's fine, but try not to go too much shorter. So I'll read this really quickly, point out a couple things, and then we will conclude this lecture. This is The Starry Night by Anne Sexton. I'm also going to include a link to her reading it herself in the quiz assignment. The Starry Night, and she has a little blurb at the beginning. That is a quote from Vincent van Gogh writing to his brother. He says, "That does not keep me from having a terrible need of, shall I say the word, religion. Then I go out at night to paint the stars." Okay, and then the poem, as Anne created it, Anne Sexton. "The town does not exist except where one black-haired tree slips up like a drowned woman into the hot sky. The town is silent. The night boils with 11 stars. Oh, starry, starry night. This is how I want to die. It moves. They are all alive. Even the moon bulges in its orange irons to push children like a god from its eye. The old unseen serpent swallows up the stars. Oh, starry, starry night. This is how I want to die. Into that rushing beast of the night, sucked up by that great dragon to split from my life with no flag, no belly, no cry." So just to conclude this conversation with y'all today, I want to say what an amazing ekphrastic poem. Okay, again, inspired by The Starry Night and by Vincent van Gogh himself. The language is so simple. There is rhyme, but it's not a sustained form. That is, she sort of slips in rhymes throughout the stanzas. By the way, if you're not familiar with that language, the paragraphs in poems are referred to as stanzas. The line breaks are where the poet decides each line is going to conclude and move to the next line. A really great poetic trick where you break the line. It changes the whole rhythm of the poem, right? So she keeps the language very simple, but the images are what I want to point out. A drowned woman into the hot sky, the black-haired tree slipping up like a drowned woman into the hot sky. That tree does look like a woman drowning and trying to escape the water. What an amazing image, right? What an amazing metaphor. And also she is letting the reader know up top, even though we're looking at this gorgeous starry night painting, that something very upsetting is happening here, something very dark. There's the light of the stars, but the darkness is encroaching, just as it was encroaching in her mind, as well as the mind of Vincent van Gogh. Oh, starry, starry night. She's crying out, "This is how I want to die. This